Okay, hi everybody. This is David Truss with PPA. We want to welcome you to our webinar on dealing with contract cancellations. Now, this is the very first of many different things we're going to be doing in the upcoming days and weeks, hopefully not months, to help mitigate what is otherwise a very difficult time for all of us. We know it's a difficult time for you. Now, by participating in this webinar, you're taking meaningful steps to understand what you should be doing now as a small business, as an entrepreneur. You know, we're all looking for clarity in a very difficult and confusing world. So we need to chat about these things, right? And so in a moment, I'm going to turn the time over to Luke Boulet, our Manager of Government Affairs here at PPA, and Stephen Morris, who's partner with Meadows, Macie, and Sutton, a law firm here in the Atlanta area. Stephen is a lawyer that oversees and handles all of our indemnification trust cases. And I should mention that Stephen was once a PPA staff member working in our marketing department, so he is very, very familiar with photographers and with the realities that you have to deal with on a daily basis. So there's no question that we are living in a unique time. I was chatting with my kids, all adults, about everything that's going on right now. I'm sure many of you have had many of the same conversations with your families. And one of my daughters last night commented that she just doesn't really have any kind of context to know how to deal with something like coronavirus and quarantine and business stoppage and empty grocery stores because, well, outside of the Atlanta area, when a couple dozen snowflakes fall and they shut down the grocery stores, aside from that, she has never really lived through anything like this. And I reminded her that, you know, I've never lived through anything like this either. Very few people have. But that doesn't mean that we have to fear. As long as we're prepared, we don't have to fear. It's better to prepare than to fear, or better to prepare than to react. Each of you is preparing by participating in this webinar today, and good for you. We applaud you for that. We'll be doing other webinars and Facebook interviews and broadcasts on how to handle your marketing and your sales initiatives and what you should be doing to ensure your business is in the right place when everything bounces back. And let me just say that it will bounce back. This is all going to bounce back. We know things look difficult now, but they're not going to stay that way. This would be a great time to be working on PPA EDU, honing your craft, spending time on gap education to strengthen your entrepreneurial muscle. So we would urge you to not just sit around, and you're not doing that. You're actually on this webinar, but don't just sit around your home. Jump on PPA EDU courses, which you get at no cost, of course. Use this time to study the gap courses and understand what it means to close the gap between you and your consumer. It's true that we may have never been through anything like this, but that doesn't mean professional photography has not weathered storm after storm after storm, guys. Economic crashes, social disruptions, and natural disasters. This is not the first crisis professional photography has had to deal with, and it likely won't be the worst or the longest. In fact, from a purely analytical standpoint, I can tell you that coronavirus is dangerous and disruptive, but it will not damage the underpinnings of the industry. We're going to come out of this, and when we do, the small businesses that take advantage of the downtime will have a head start on everyone else, and you guys are doing that. So our message today is to be safe, to be smart, to stay calm because we will get through this together, and to keep our eye on the ball. And today that ball is going to be dealing with cancellations and contracts. And so with that, I'm going to turn you over to Luke and to Stephen. Guys, you're up to bat.
Thank you, David. My name is Luke Boulet, and I have the pleasure of serving as PPA's Government Affairs Manager. David he introduced Stephen. As you know, he's the attorney at Meadows, Macie, and Sutton, but more importantly, he's PPA's indemnification trust attorney. This makes him extremely knowledgeable about the photography industry, which is why we asked him to join us today. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and a copy will be sent to you within 24 hours to watch the replay. Second, we will be hosting a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please save your questions for the end. Feel free to type in your questions in the questions panel as we move through the webinar, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. Now, let's go ahead and get started. In light of the coronavirus, today we'll be discussing photographer obligations when a client wants to cancel your contract for photography services. photography services. Before we get started, there are a few things I want you to keep in mind. The first is, while this information is meant to be educational, it does not constitute legal advice. Because contract law is controlled by the state, we recommend that you still contact an attorney in your state to verify how the terms of your agreement would be interpreted and enforced under your state's laws. The second thing is, we want you to remember that we will be providing examples of clauses from various contracts we have seen and discussing the clauses. The specific provisions you use in your own agreements is a matter of preference and choice. PPA does not endorse or recommend any specific contract language. Use the webinar as guidance on examining your own agreements and helping you decide what clauses make the most sense going forward. How you choose to handle cancellations is a business decision. Ideally, that business decision will be reflected in your language of your contract. The contract sets out requirements for what must be done in a situation, but you have the option of waiving those requirements to be more generous with your client if you determine it is appropriate. In terms of definitions, one definition that we must understand is force majeure, or act of God clause. Force majeure clause is French for superior force. It is a contract provision that allows a party to suspend or terminate the performance of its obligations when certain circumstances are beyond their control. And now we'll turn it over to Stephen Morris, attorney at Meadows, Macie, and Sutton, who will go over some examples of cancellation and limitations on liability clauses in contracts.
Well, thank you, Luke. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here in what is definitely an uncertain time. We're going to go over some common approaches that we see through the indemnification trust that we've seen over the years in contracts. As we go through this period, I think there are two essential things for photographers to keep in mind. One is something that was explained to me when I came to work for PPA back in 1996, almost 25 years ago now, I guess, which is that no matter what kind of photography you do, photographers are in a relationship business. And so while you've got legal agreements, you've got contracts that spell out the basic minimums of how the relationship is going to work, that ultimately at the end of the day, it is a people business. And so as we go through this difficult period of uncertainty, it's important to know what's in your agreement, certainly, but more important is to work with your clients to the best of your ability so that you can continue those relationships. So the first of the three examples we're going to go over is the most common setup we see in contracts. And I apologize for having slides that have lots of words on them. Unfortunately, this is an area where that's somewhat of a necessity. In most photography contracts, what we'll see is a pair of clauses. One that talks about a non-refundable retainer, which in this slide is clause A, that says essentially, by signing this agreement, you're agreeing to pay me a certain amount as a non-refundable retainer, and we're not going to take any more applications for your date, and therefore that's non-refundable. Somewhere else in the agreement, usually lurking down around in what's something called a limitations of liability clause, you'll see an act of God or force majeure clause that says something to the effect that if the photographer cannot perform the agreement in whole or in part due to fire or other casualty, acts of God or nature or terror, or other cause beyond the control of the parties, or photographer's illness, etc., then the photographer's liability will be limited either to return of all funds paid or all funds, such as in our example, less any costs already used, i.e. plane tickets or engagement sessions, something along those lines. So while you've got a non-refundable retainer in this agreement, if that force majeure clause kicks in, it wipes out the ability to keep that non-refundable retainer. at least the way this particular one is set up. The question, of course, then becomes, well, what's force majeure? What is that? When does that kick in? And probably the best analogy I can provide for that, and any of our photographers with us today who live in coastal areas and deal with hurricanes probably have something, or have dealt with a similar situation before. You have an unforeseen natural event that pretty much prevents anyone from doing any business. And so these clauses get kicked in. The same thing here right now. If you've got event closures, if you've got your state or local government preventing people from gathering in groups of more than 25, 50, or 100, obviously that makes it impossible for folks to move on, and that's beyond your control. Therefore, that clause, the force majeure, is going to kick in, and should the client desire it, and if the client does not want to reschedule the event or reschedule the event with you, then under this type of agreement, you're responsible for providing a refund of all the funds that they have paid to you, which would include the otherwise non-refundable retainer. A difference is if you have a client who, is looking at the current situation, they're contracted with you for September. Hopefully, this will be all well over by then. Certainly, no one in the United States has required any limitation on public gatherings going out that far. So if a client that's well off in the distance from a timeline perspective approaches you and says, well, we need to cancel because of coronavirus, that kind of cancellation, because it is not outside the control of the parties, would not require refunding of that non-refundable deposit, because at that point, it's no longer the act of nature that is the triggering event. It's their concern that's well beyond anything that's going on right now. The second type of contract agreement we see on a regular basis has a non-refundable deposit, but is silent as the question of natural disasters or force majeure clauses. And these type of agreements simply say, you're paying a non-refundable reservation fee or deposit, I'm holding your date. If the wedding is canceled for any reason, or if the date is canceled for any reason, I'm going to keep the retainer. Under contract law, in these cases, more often than not, you're going to be able to keep the non-refundable retainer or deposit. There are some cases where, again, if it's a matter of quarantine or no public gatherings, that if the issue were pressed, a court might say, well, under the doctrine of contractual impossibility, it was impossible to have the event, we're just going to cancel the contract outright, and you might have to return the retainer. But under normal circumstances, this type of agreement, unless it's canceled at the request of the photographer, should allow you to keep that retainer. And of course, the third type of contract setup we see is a little more aggressive than the others. These are contracts where you have a non-refundable retainer, the usual language associated with that. And then you have a second clause that says, in the event of a cancellation for any reason, the client agrees that the studio shall be entitled to retain all funds paid toward the balance of the contract as liquidated damages. In other cases, you'll see, or we've seen contracts that say, well, if you cancel within a certain time period before the wedding, you still owe us the balance of the contract payments, regardless of the reason. These types of contract provisions are typically frowned on by the courts. The reason for that is, from a legal perspective, what the court looks at, or what the other attorney, when they send you a letter, is going to be looking at, is to say, we understand a non-refundable retainer or deposit because that's keeping your time slot open, and there's some indication of what you would make on the job as far as holding that back. However, you haven't had to do any work toward this contract in regard to actually shooting it, so you shouldn't be able to get a windfall since you're not taking costs out for labor or printing or anything along those lines. So we're not going to let you keep that. And that's oftentimes what you see. It's possible to have a liquidated damage provision that is honored by a court. It does happen from time to time, but those are generally disfavored. In this kind of situation, again, where you've got possibly, depending on the specific facts, a situation where a wedding is canceled because the state or local government prohibits public gatherings of more than 35 people in your state or your local community. In those cases, if push came to shove, our general experience is that a court would likely make you return all the funds and not pursue those additional funds. So those are kind of the three basic setups we see and how they generally play out. One thing that we need to talk about, and I mentioned it several times, is this notion of contract impossibility. And I believe that's on the next slide. All right. So the key difference in these situations is whether or not the contract cancellation is triggered by, in this case, a pandemic, or if it's triggered basically by the fears or concerns of the client that aren't directly related to the pandemic. So right now, and we actually had to update this as late as this morning, there are a number of states that are limiting gatherings over a certain size. Statewide in California, the last I heard was 250, but you got the mayor in San Francisco limiting it to 100. Los Angeles is 50. Santa Clara County, which covers most of Silicon Valley, is down to 35 folks. A lot of states are going with a limitation of 50, as you can see there, and some are even going lower. Massachusetts and Oregon, last I saw, were at 25. And this is a rapidly moving thing. So if you've got weddings coming up in the next 4 weeks, these are the types of things that may have an impact on you and the ability for that event to even go forward. And to the extent that there has been a declaration from state government, local government that prohibits these kinds of things, then that makes it impossible. That's different from the CDC guideline, which doesn't necessarily have the force of law and is merely a suggestion at this point. The other issue that you can run into, even if the event size is underneath the threshold where you've got an event space that's hosting the event and they either can't get catering, can't get staffing, or have simply decided to shutter their doors and shut down for the duration. So it's entirely possible that in the coming weeks, you may have an event that could otherwise go forward, but is also made impossible by one of those downline vendors from you simply not being available and making it impossible for the client to go forward. So again, that's a different situation from someone looking at a September wedding who says, well, I'm concerned about some things and let's go ahead and cancel now. That doesn't get you into force majeure territory. These types of things that everyone's facing in the near term, however, do kick those contract provisions in. Part of the question, of course, is when faced with a cancellation, is what to do about it and how to deal with the client about it. As Luke said earlier and David alluded to as well, that's a business decision. One of the things that you can do there, and with the understanding that there's only 52 weekends in a year, and you may already be booked out for the year, and if you are, that's wonderful. However, if you're not, or if you've got some additional capacity, talking to your clients who are just as upset and terrified, but perhaps for slightly different reasons than a lot of us in the professional world are, because they've got this event that this is the only wedding they're doing. It's not one of 25 that they may do in a year. And so they're lost, they're at a loss. And in those kinds of situations, people tend to get very, very rigid in their thinking. And one of the things that you can do as a business owner is to remain creative in your approach to your clients, just as you do your work. And one of the ways to be creative, of course, is when that client comes calling and says, "Oh my goodness, we're 3 weeks out and it's got to be canceled. I need to cancel my contract and talk to you about getting my money back." The place to start that conversation from your side is, look, we understand everybody's going through this, but let's take a deep breath here for just a second and tell me what you plan on doing as far as rescheduling your event. And when you start the conversation that way, you're doing a couple of things. One, you're slowing things down and cutting down on that frantic response from this bride or groom or this parent, and giving them some space to think about something that they may not have really considered because they're only acting in the moment. The other thing you're doing there is, if they have not considered rescheduling because they're not looking that far down the road, this gives you an opportunity to be the first vendor who really takes them in hand and does that with them, so that you've got an opportunity, depending on your capacity, to work with them on a possible reschedule to not only save whatever funds that you have already obtained from this client, but also to save the job, save the relationship, and save the future business that may come out of referrals from that. So to the extent that that's possible, what you want to do is, rather than scrapping your old contract entirely and saying, well, we're just going to cancel that out, the easiest thing to do in most cases is an agreement or an amendment to that agreement that essentially postpones it. Ideally, if you can get a date certain, and that may not come in the first conversation, but if you can get a date certain and you're going to be available, just something as simple as the sample language we've got up on the screen now that says, we have a pre-existing contract relating to a wedding that was going to happen this date. We're amending that so the date is now a due date. Removing all the deadlines as far as deliverables or payments, if necessary, about that. And all the other terms and conditions of the contract remain the same. By having both parties sign something like that, at that point, you've got a binding amendment to the contract that saves the relationship and just postpones it. Now, there may be other cases where you're not available for that future date, or they're not sure about what that future date is going to be. If they're not sure about the future date, it may be just a matter of holding things sort of in a holding pattern where they're at until they come to some sort of decision about that. And it's entirely possible that in some of these situations, particularly with weddings, that if they didn't buy travel insurance or other things, that their budget may be changing. So don't necessarily be surprised if a client that you're able to retain comes back and says, well, we've already lost this much on this, and we may need to swap packages or do something different. So again, that's a possibility that you need to be mindful of. And there's no one answer to that, but that's ideally what you want to do, is try to get a postponement agreement so that you can maintain that relationship. Before we go into questions, I just sort of want to bookend on what David Trust had to say at the beginning of this program. Yeah, I've been involved in the professional photography business or around it for nearly 25 years. And while we haven't seen anything exactly like what we're experiencing today, in the time after 9/11, back when folks were still shooting on film, and suddenly you couldn't mail things because everything was being x-rayed and airports were shut down, and there was a lot of uncertainty over that. The industry as a whole and photographers got through it. It wasn't always easy, it wasn't always comfortable, but they got through it. A few years after that, with the digital revolution, essentially the old model of the way photography was sold was essentially turned on its head. And that was a major upheaval for this industry. But individual photographers working together through PPA figured it out, and we got through it and came through it stronger. And here we sit in 2020 with the organization having grown well beyond its old bounds of what they thought was even possible in providing services. So, with that in mind, this in the long term, while it's a very serious issue at the moment, in the course of your photography career, hopefully will just be a blip on the radar and something that we remember having gotten through. But it's certainly not going to last forever. So with that, and Luke, unless you have anything else, I think we can open it up for questions.
Very good. Thank you, Stephen. Yes. Now we'd like to open up the Q&A portion of the presentation, and our first question comes from Kimberly. Kimberly was stating that 6 counties in the San Francisco area have now instituted shelter at home. So, like Stephen was saying, this is an ongoing situation, and the key is to stay informed and keep a lookout for what is happening in your state, your local jurisdiction, and federal. And the situation is ongoing, and it's not going to remain static. Our next question is from Melissa, and she says, at the same time, I have clients for future events to pay for part or full amount to help cover current cancellations. And it was actually a correction. Clients for future events have asked for part payment. I'm not entirely sure at how this question is being asked. Stephen, could you help with this?
Yeah, let me see
this question about paying for part or full amount to help cover current cancellations.
Certainly, I can take a stab at that. And I may be misunderstanding the question from Melissa, so I apologize if I have. Obviously, well, the way I'm interpreting the question is, if you're taking funds, reservation funds from future clients to pay off refunds to canceled clients, that's obviously not an ideal situation. You want to avoid doing that if at all possible, if you can.
Okay. Our next question comes from Charlie. He says, am I hearing correctly that my non-refundable retainer must be given back even if they elect to postpone to a new date I'm not available for?
It depends on the other language in your contract. If you've got a contract that has a force majeure clause that says, in the event the photographer is unable to do the job based on, acts of God, nature, or terrorism, anything like that, or pandemic, then that particular phrase is going to override the non-refundable retainer portion of the agreement. And this is one of those situations, unfortunately, we all go through life sort of thinking we know what's in our agreements. And until something like this happens, it's not really a phrase that you probably paid a whole lot of attention to, because it was just in there when I got my contract from whomever I got my contract from. And I think what it says is this, but now we're in a situation where the strict language of those agreements is going to govern the situation as far as return of retainers. So if your provision says something along the lines of a force majeure clause, then chances are very good, yes, you would need to refund all of that.
Okay. Our next question comes from Mary, and she says, what do I do if a bride decides to go ahead with the with their event despite an edict limiting public gatherings to 50 or 10?
That gets to be a much more difficult situation, and we actually have had that in a hurricane before, where there was a closure. The photographer literally could not get there, and the bride went forward and then came after the photographer afterwards for having the gall not to go through several roadblocks and closed roads to show up at a resort. In this particular instance, it's a little bit more nuanced. If the wedding certainly is expected to be larger than the size, that's a judgment call you're going to have to make as a business owner or photographer. One thing I would be sure of is if you're in an area where public gatherings are limited, the client is going through, with the event, make sure you reach out to them in writing, advise them of the fact that, there's a public health edict that you'd be in violation of law if you went. There's certainly still some risk there for you as a photographer, because it's always possible that, a court may interpret something like that differently and see that situation differently. But typically you're not going to be under any requirement to perform that contract in the way that's going to make you act contrary to binding local law.
Okay. And this question comes from Jasmine. Would force majeure still come into play when a couple could legally still get married as long as they kept the limit to their guest list?
If they're underneath the limit, and that's the interesting thing, I suppose, about these sorts of things. If you live in an area where the limit is 50 and the expected size of the wedding is going to be less than that, or less than whatever the local provision is, then that's a wedding that goes forward. And that's one of those situations where it doesn't fall necessarily under the doctrine of impossibility, which is what's required in these situations. It's certainly difficult, and it certainly places you in something of an awkward position. But if they're underneath the limit, then that's not a cancellation that's outside the control of the parties. That becomes something within the control of the parties.
Okay. Our next question comes from Stephanie. She's asking, what happens when I don't have the money to return the retainer? What if I can't afford to pay back said retainer?
That's obviously a difficult problem from a cash flow perspective. One of the alternatives you can offer, and again, there are things that the contract says that you have to do, and legally, if push comes to shove, whatever's in the contract is going to govern the relationship. If you find yourself in that difficult situation where financially things have been running close and you suddenly are owing folks refunds, one of the things that you can try to do certainly is to say, look, I was certainly looking forward to photographing your event or your family portrait, whatever, and try to frankly see if they're interested in doing something else as far as other product or something along those lines. I've also seen situations where a photographer had something fairly catastrophic go on in their personal life and ended up, entering agreements for basically a payment plan to repay their clients. That's not something anybody looks forward to having to do, but those are some options that you have if you find yourself in that situation.
Okay. Our next question comes from Andy. Andy's asking, if I'm in a 60+ age group, if I'm uncomfortable with my own safety for an event due to the virus situation, how can I write a contract giving me the option to opt out for my own personal concern? It is
force
majeure. a bilateral situation where either party can cancel?
Force majeure is bilateral in the sense that it's got to be something outside the control of the parties. So it basically means that the event can't go on or the contract can't be performed for reasons outside your control. One thing for Andy and anybody else in that situation, where you find yourself, if you're in a population that's more susceptible to this thing, is take a close look at your contract to see if you have a substitution clause. There are two differences we run into with that, particularly through the trust. One is whether your contract is for you personally to shoot the job. Because if it's with the studio and you've got other folks that work with you who shoot, then that may be a possibility. You just need to make sure that the client knows and understands what's going on. The other thing is, an illness of the photographer clause that allows a substitution. This doesn't quite fall under that, but it's close to that. And if you've got, something along those lines, finding an appropriate substitute, working with the client as far as the identity of that substitute and their capabilities is probably your better bet.
Okay. Next question comes from Kristen. She's asking, I have a client who's rescheduling their April wedding to September because of a coronavirus. My contract does not allow rescheduling. However, I'm offering one-time exemption as goodwill. Can you help with how I deal with the addendum to the contract? I think we might have addressed this with our slide towards the end. This is a question that was submitted around 2:18, so I don't think we reached that point in the presentation.
Yeah. And Luke, just as a sort of an add-on to that, obviously, and that's the kind of things that we hope that most of our members will experience, as far as folks just pushing weddings back and being able to reschedule and do amendments. And as you said, what's on the slide is sort of that basic language that says we're changing the date. Anything related to that date is changed, but everything else stays in place the way it was. So.
Okay, our next question comes from Sonia. She's saying, I had a wedding scheduled for this Friday in San Francisco. Last week, the client canceled the wedding by their choice. They had a paid retainer, which my contract states is non-refundable, but can be applied to a new date that is mutually agreeable for the both of us. The client is not amenable to this. While I do not have the specific mention of force majeure, I do have a limits of liability clause in my contract that discusses what would happen if I, as a photographer, could not photograph this wedding. That I will only, that will only what the client has paid me, given that the client canceled prior to the San Francisco's current shelter in place. Is the retainer still non-refundable, or because I would technically no longer be able to photograph the wedding, would the courts think I would need to refund the retainer?
And that's a very, very specific question that's probably beyond the bounds of what I can do as someone who's not licensed to practice law in California. Generally speaking, though, timing matters in these situations. If someone canceled, well before we knew that there would be, this level of restriction, then there's a greater likelihood that you'd be able to keep the retainer, because the reason at the time of the cancellation was not necessarily something beyond the control of the parties. Now, the reality of this, if push came to shove in front of a judge, is once all of this is over and done with, hopefully sooner rather than later, judges are human as well, and they may take a viewpoint that's more likely to give somebody their money back. But if they didn't work with you on doing a rescheduled date or have no interest and they're just canceling the wedding, they're much less likely to be able to get that non-refundable retainer back.
And then, Stephen, we're having a few questions about, what if you're not available for the rescheduled date?
And that's the trickier part. If you're not available for the rescheduled date, at that point, you're probably going to be governed by the force majeure clause because your contract was for that specific date that's been moved or that's been canceled. So it would really, again, it all goes back to the language of the agreement. But if you're unavailable for the rescheduled date, the reason for the cancellation is still something outside the control of the parties. So your force majeure clause is still going to be applicable. Alternatives, of course, if you're not available on their date, if you've got another shooter that works for you, preferably also who's a PPA member covered by the PPA trust in case something goes wrong. But then, associate shooters are certainly a possibility there if that's something that you've got capacity for. Otherwise, the force majeure clause is going to govern because it was a cancellation beyond the control of the parties.
Okay. And our next question comes from Dawn. She's asking, how far out would you have a conversation with clients regarding their event? 2 weeks out or farther into April? I don't want to alarm clients, but preparing and opening a line of communication, I feel, is a good idea.
It's a very good idea. It's an excellent idea. This is a situation where, while we all worry about panicking our customers or clients, they're already panicked. They're already concerned. And, reaching out as their photographer, even if it's, 6 weeks, to say, we're monitoring things right now, it's only extends to this date. We're going to be ready to shoot your event if, things have cleared up by then. And if not, then we'll certainly work with you on options for rescheduling because, we're excited to be your photographer and we're excited to photograph your wedding. And there's no real downside to that given the current circumstances and given the fact that you've got folks who are worried about their events and who are essentially sitting at home for the next couple of weeks in most parts of the country with not much else to do other than worry about that. So I think that's an excellent idea.
We have a question from Bob. He's asking, is credit for other goods or services a good first attempt to avoid a deposit refund?
It is. It's certainly an option. But if they say no, then at that point you're still obligated to provide the refund. But we all know that product is cheaper than money. And if you've got a client that's amenable to doing something else, some sort of substitution, then certainly that's an option.
Hey, Stephen, this is David. Well, Luke's doing an impossible task. That's trying to scan through all of these questions at the same time to decide which ones are similar and which ones are not. And so it's a very difficult thing for him to do. But you and I have worked together a lot over the years, and I think it's worth just mentioning, which you did already to some degree, but it's difficult times like these. Brand is everything in professional photography. As a photographer, everything depends on your brand and on how people feel about you, because that's what brand is, right? It's about how people feel about you. And the decisions, the questions you guys are asking are good questions, and they're heartbreaking because you see real world examples of what's actually happening out there, and it hurts. The thought of what all small businesses, including professional photographers, are going through right now, and it's a difficult thing. And certainly Stephen's providing very wise counsel, I think, for all of us. And the one thing I think is important to remember is that this is the time when companies that step forward, small businesses that step forward, really have the opportunity to earn their brand. And if there's ever any way possible to work with a company to make things easier on them, to say, hey, we're all in this together, and to let them know that we're fighting through this together and we're going to get through this together. I mean, it may not always go the way we want it, but it's more important to escape, to survive all of this with our brand intact or even stronger than it is right now. And we certainly want to be known as small businesses that care about our customers. And so as you consider all of your options, these options that Stephen has given you, you certainly want to consider the cost of the money that you might be receiving as part of a deposit. So there is a cost to that money, and you just want to make sure that you're considering that. We're not telling you to do one thing or another. We're just saying make sure you're considering that in all of these discussions. And with that, maybe I wasn't trying to stall, but I've given Luke enough time to catch up on some of his questions. So back to Luke.
Thank you, David.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry, just put myself on mute. I'm next to a train station. So we have a question asking about from Darcy. She's asking about what do we do a lot of bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, and one client's event will have to be rescheduled, but no idea when. But she definitely wants to use me if I'm available. Should I still put something in writing with her now, or like you suggest, keep things in a holding pattern until they do know?
I think in that situation, something less than the formal agreement, but just an email communication, some sort of written communication with the client, say, recapping the fact that we've talked about this, and obviously these are difficult times, and you don't have a replacement date yet. Subject to availability, we'll certainly be happy and look forward to photographing the event under the current contract with a new date. Again, subject to availability, and just confirming that in writing, and hopefully they'll respond. That way, 6 months from now or 3 months from now, whenever these things are resolved and whenever they come up with a replacement date, there's no dispute about what transpired or what the agreement was. One of the most dangerous things we see in any business situation is where folks have talked about something and have come away from that with a memory of what they discussed. And then after 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, that memory is subject to change. Or perhaps there was a miscommunication with the client or a misunderstanding about how things were going to go. So recapping that sort of thing, and not an overly legalistic email, just something that says this is what we talked about and this is what we're decided to do, is extremely important, so you can avoid those misunderstandings, and really just as a reminder to yourself once the client comes back and says, oh yeah, we talked about X, Y, and Z. So again, it may not be necessary to do a formal agreement or formal amendment if you don't have a date. Well, you certainly can do that if you want to. The second option there, or the other option there, again, is just a confirmation email so that nobody gets lost 6 weeks down the road and forgets what was agreed to.
Hey, Stephen, we've got another question over here. The question is there language I might use to request deposits after the fact if they weren't collected prior to signing the contract?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, which I may not be, typically in your agreements, if you've got a contract agreement that doesn't include language that allows you to collect those deposits up front, you can't go back later and just amend and say, oh, by the way, we need those now. So you really can't go back on that. If you are looking at contracts going forward, most commonly what we see, and I think this was on the slide, is language that's saying that the deposit, or the non-refundable retainer rather, or non-refundable deposit, is due at the time of signing of the contract, and that the date won't be held until that payment is made. Which I think may answer that question, but I'm not sure.
Thank you for that. We have another question, and this is more about, what is the best way to reach out to an attorney in your state? If we're going to be looking at state-to-state clauses and contracts, do you have any recommendations for that?
Oftentimes you'll have a local bar association, and really what you're looking for is an attorney who works with small businesses, ideally. They'll often say that they do business law, because again, it's even though the contract, there are specific things that we deal with in photography and photography services that are, sort of unique to the profession. All of the legal underpinnings of those agreements are really just a matter of general business law. So whether it's through your local bar association, possibly your state bar association, there are also listings. There's a group called Martindale-Hubbell that keeps listings, and there's several others online. But look for somebody who, again, works with small businesses, works with local companies, and has a business background, and I think you'll probably be in good shape.
Great, thank you. And now we have, this is kind of an interesting question, a unique one that's come up. What about for destination weddings? So US-based photographers working on a wedding, someone who is not from the US, how should you navigate those cancellations?
So if you've got two pieces there, if you've got a destination wedding where you are going to be traveling, or the client is going to be traveling to you. For instance, I know a lot of photographers in South Florida and Hawaii do a lot of destination business. And if you've got a client who is traveling from a country that's currently subject to a travel ban, that makes that impossible. If you literally can't get into the country from there right now, then that's going to fall under your force majeure type clause, because one of the participants of the ceremony literally cannot get here for reasons beyond her control. And so that sort of falls into that same analysis of, is this because of something that's within our control, or is it something that's outside of her control? And here, if she's from a country that flights are not able to come in, that's out of her control, and that falls into your force majeure clause.
Thanks, Stephen. Our next question is from G. They're asking, I've been offering an associate photographer to shoot their wedding in case I'm not available for the new date. Each case is a case, and the couples have been happy and with this alternative, and I don't have to issue refunds because their original refund is put towards the new date. It definitely affects my availability for new couples, but in my case, it's been helping. My question, is it okay to put the retainer towards the new date?
I believe that if the question is it okay to take the retainer from the old contract to the same client and apply it to the new date? And certainly, absolutely, it is. And that's one of those, business things. You're not really wiping out the old contract. You're essentially just amending it for a new date. So what you would want to do, just from a good client perspective, and frankly a good business perspective, is obviously just transfer those funds over, because otherwise you would have lost that retainer, because it would have been impossible to shoot their wedding on the originally scheduled date. And as sort of a sidebar to that question, and this is an issue that we've run into over the years through the Indemnification Trust, and touches on copyright. If you're using an associate photographer, a couple of things. One, ideally, make sure they're a PPA member, so if something goes wrong, they are covered by the PPA Indemnification Trust. But the other part of that is if you're using an associate photographer who works for you from time to time as an independent contractor, not as a W-2 employee, then you need to make sure your agreement with that associate photographer spells out copyright ownership, because as most of you hopefully know, the photographer who creates an image is the owner of the copyright to that image, unless they're an employee or they've signed a work for hire agreement. So if you have an occasional shooter that is doing work for you, technically, under federal law, they would be the copyright owner of the works they create, and there's an implied license to allow you to, use those images, obviously, to fulfill your contract. So whatever the terms of your agreement with those associate photographers are, I would strongly encourage you to put those in writing and to make sure that you address those ownership issues and, rights of display and things like that, so that you don't run into dispute later with them if that relationship goes sideways. So that's just a little extra addendum to that kind of situation.
Thanks, Stephen. We have a comment from John. He's saying, I think it's good business. I think good business practices prevail. While it's not your fault that the client cancels, it's not their fault either. You may lose the revenue, but gain the respect as a compassionate business person.
Exactly, and that goes back to the point that, again, photography is about relationships. When you photograph someone, at a wedding, obviously you're photographing not just people, but you're photographing that relationship. When you photograph a family grouping, you're not just photographing a set of heads, you're photographing that relationship between those people. And as a photographer, your business is built on capturing those relationships and also servicing the relationship that you have with those clients in that connection. So yes, at the end of the day, everyone has to pay their bills. Everyone has to figure out the financial side of things, and it is a business, certainly. But the relational business, the relational side of it is really the foundation that all of that rests on. So as we go through these difficult times, as I said, when people get pressed, people tend to get very rigid in their thinking and lose that creativity that comes, from being a photographer and small business owner. And the important thing is to try to stay centered and focused on that so that you can serve those clients, not just through the next several weeks, but through the next several years.
Stephen, we're getting some questions related to whether or not the coronavirus.
Luke, I'm having some trouble hearing you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So we're getting some questions about whether or not the virus will be considered a force majeure.
The virus itself is not, it's the governmental reaction to it. And there are some force majeure clauses that are very general and just say, acts of God, nature, terrorism, and just kind of, are very, very broad. There are other force majeure clauses that you'll see in other types of agreements. And we typically don't see these with photography agreements, but sometimes we do. Where there's a very specific list. And there have been cases where if the item is not on the very specific list, that a court would interpret that in a way that says, well, you bargained for fire, flood, and hurricane, but you didn't bargain for pandemic. Therefore, the force majeure clause isn't going to apply. Most of the photography agreements that we see are much broader than that as far as the force majeure clause. And even if you don't fall into force majeure, the doctrine of impossibility is kind of an independent thing that can be applied outside of force majeure. where either common law or civil law, depending on your jurisdiction, is often going to say, well, in that case, we're going to act like the contract never occurred, and we're going to restore the parties to their previous position, which as a business owner puts you in the position of having to return or refund a retainer. So, while there are legal distinctions to be made, given the circumstances, I think the law is going to be relatively generous to the client side on this sort of thing.
Our next question is, if a bride is trying to book a wedding for June, assuming that the restrictions will be lifted by then, should I be sending over a contract and doing business as usual, or should I be more prudent and ride this out with no money or signatures exchanged for now?
I would keep on doing business and keep on taking retainers and continue on. And the reason for that, you don't want to put things on hold. We don't know, what the sort of the end game or what the drawdown on this thing is going to be. That's not something that we can currently predict. Most closures I'm seeing are, in the nature of 4 weeks, and we'll check again, at the end of the 4 weeks, sort of thing. But the general just seems to be that most restrictions will be lifted, before then. You may, want to look at your contract, and if there's something you need to add as a result of what you've seen so far or what we've experienced so far, then that may be something you want to look into as far as an additional clause in those agreements that deals with this situation specifically. But the reality is, life continues to move forward and business continues to move forward. So, I would continue booking at this point.
Our next question is, we have a bride insisting on going forward on April 4th with 300 RSVPs. She claims unless it's Marshall's law, 86-year-old grandpa is coming who is ill. They're paid in full. Any advice as to how to change my very hands-on approach to wedding photography so I nor anyone else is in danger of contracting the virus? We're not in the place to offer a refund or refuse to shoot the wedding.
And that presents obviously a difficult situation, and you've got a client who's made some decisions about how she's going to proceed. So, in that situation, if you're committed to shooting the event, you shoot the event. Obviously, take a look at the Centers for Disease Control and what their advice is. They do actually have pages on, if you have a large public event and are intent on going forward with it, they actually have some tips. I looked this morning, I believe that's cdc.gov, where they talk about things to do. Obviously, to the extent that you can maintain distance, that's something that everyone's recommending. The whole issue with hand washing, not touching the face, but that's more of a medical thing, and so I would strongly encourage you to look at the CDC website and get some information from there about conduct and things that you can do there.
Our next question is asking whether or not the indemnification trust will cover canceled contracts.
So under the terms of the trust, and a couple of caveats here. One, each trust claim is decided individually, but it's governed by something we call the trust declaration, which limits what we can actually pay out on and what we can't pay out on. Cancellations are not an area that we can actually provide indemnification for, because in that case, there's been no allegation of negligence or wrongdoing against the photographer. It's simply just a matter of a cancellation. So, and obviously we work closely with, PPA staff and member services on, when we've got somebody who calls in with that kind of situation, on trying to help folks navigate that, just as a matter of, providing good member service. But as far as, straight up cancellations, that's not something that the trust is designed to handle. However, let me just sort of add, if you've got, a situation like that where there's, an argument over whether something falls under force majeure, certainly if, you contact PPA and, talk to somebody from member services, they may end up filing, a claim for you, even if it's not covered, so that we can, try to get you some information and help on interpreting things or something along those lines.
Our next question is, when a contract says the deposit is non-refundable regardless of circumstances, does that cover me to not have to pay the deposit back at least?
Unfortunately, on that one, you're going to get the lawyerly answer of it depends. Chances are good that yes, if it's non-refundable, if the contract says non-refundable if canceled for any reason, as long as it wasn't, your decision as a photographer to not go forward, then generally speaking, you would be able to, keep that retainer. Again, if it got before a judge, under these circumstances in the current environment, they may decide something else that doesn't necessarily follow the letter of your contract. That's always a possibility. But generally speaking, if the risk in the contract has been allocated in such a way that any cancellation allows you to retain the retainer, then chances are good you would be able to keep it. But again, there's no certainty there in the current circumstances.
And Stephen, what if you reschedule, but this extends and the cancellation happens again?
Then unfortunately you find yourself right back in the same position that you were in, however many months before. And at that point, it really, again, just as it did the first time, is going to depend on your availability and what the client is interested or willing to do. We haven't seen a whole lot of changes in behavior other than people, staying home or having to cancel events. If we get into an extended thing where, it's 9 months or something like that, we may see some social differences where people start saying, well, rather than having, the wedding like this, we're going to go ahead and get married and do this, and then later on we'll have a reception or something along those lines. And that's, something that would have to be dealt with if we start seeing that. As of the moment, in that situation, you essentially just try for another extension. But again, that's going to depend on client preferences at that point.
And our next question is, we have a May couple looking to reschedule, possibly cancel. Is May too far out to claim act of God?
And that gets kind of close to the line at this point. And it may be that, in 30 days, it's not. It really just depends. So that's sort of an unknown. Like I said, right now, and at least what I'm seeing is 4-week closures, and a lot of it has to do with, frankly, statutes about emergency powers for state governments, where they do a 30-day order and then they renew or choose what to do at the end of that 30 days. So if folks are looking at May cancellations, that's probably, at least from a legal perspective, a little bit early. At the same time, from a business perspective, if you've got clients who are uncomfortable and who are worried, and really erring on the side of caution to say, my wedding's the first weekend in May. Currently, things are, everything's canceled between now and the mid-April. That's only 2 weeks after that. Can you work with me on a reschedule? Then, from a business perspective, certainly the answer is yes, absolutely. Let's work on a reschedule. So that's one of those situations where the technical, lawyerly answer differs, I think, from the best practice business answer.
Our next question is, if I send a client roughly 50 available wedding dates this year, a dozen of which are even Saturdays, and they decide to book a date I don't have availability for a wedding now, despite the fact that it is not scheduled until the end of May. I'm thinking the non-refundable retainer comes into play rather than acts of God. Is that true?
That's sort of a difficult assessment to make based on the limited information we've got. There is that notion of what's reasonable as far as reworking, and certainly we've seen situations where folks say, well, I'm worried about this and we're canceling, and that may not actually be why they're canceling, which, if you've provided that many other optional dates through the end of the year, kind of, it may be, and perhaps I'm not giving your client enough of the benefit of the doubt, but it may be that they're just canceling, period, and are using this as an excuse. So if you've provided that many alternate dates and they're absolutely refusing to commit to any alternate date or suggest that they're even going to go forward, I think there's at least a very good argument there that the real reason for this cancellation is not anything having to do with coronavirus, but is more a function of something that was going to happen regardless. Because we've certainly seen that, before. So that's one of those situations where you kind of have to use your judgment on that, but it sounds like it might fall into the category of being able to keep that retainer.
Okay, and I just wanted to advise everyone that we will be continuing for about another 15 minutes, and then we'll be wrapping it up. But our next question is about dealing with large corporations when they've been a longtime partner and they've been talking postponement for the next calendar. Do I push for cancellation fees, or because it's a small vendor, should I not upset the client and just say that will be great?
As hard as it is to stand there and smile in the face of that sort of thing, whether it's a client relationship with a large client or a small client or an individual client, there certainly is some go along, get along that has to happen there. As difficult as it is for you individually, if you're trying to maintain that client relationship, this is one of those times where, being the photographer that they can rely on and count on and who's flexible, but they're still willing to pay is the better outcome, certainly.
Question. Our next question is about if you have a clause that says
Sorry, Luke, I think I've lost you again.
Sorry about that. Just get back to my original question. So if you have a clause that says cancellations require a payment based on a timeline or percentage, are they enforceable?
Again, it always depends on the facts and the circumstances. If you've got one, for instance, that says, you've got to cancel at least 30 days in advance, or, X, Y, and Z happen, then, depending on why the cancellation occurs and exactly how the contract is structured, it's possible that those can be enforced. The issue is where the court believes that you're getting a windfall from not having to shoot a job. For instance, your full contract price from a legal perspective includes not only your profit, but all your underlying costs, including the cost of your labor as a photographer. And so when a court sees someone who's trying to retain all of that, all those funds without any deduction or offset, without actually having to have shot the job and incurred those labor costs or product costs, they tend to frown on that. So that's really the issue with that kind of agreement. And just as an addendum, one of the other issues that you run into, and I've seen this before, that that says if you don't cancel your contract with me, more than X number of days out, you're responsible for making the remainder of the payments. And having talked to photographers over the years, one constant that anybody who comes to me with that sort of issue is, do you really want to be the photographer known for going after his clients for the remainder of a balance on a job that you didn't shoot? And the answer to that, of course, is no. From a reputational perspective, that's not a good thing to have out in the community. So that's one of those provisions that even if you have it, you may want to consider carefully before proceeding on it.
Can we proactively have our contract? Sorry. And I think we end up answering this question. Sorry about that. If I have a contract employee who picks up the virus while working a wedding for us, what is our liability as an LLC?
Again, that's going to depend partially on state law and other things. We've not seen traditionally workman's comp, depending on whether or not they would qualify as covered in your state. Typically involves actual physical injuries and not contracting a virus while you're working. At least not in that context. So the chances are fairly low that that's something that you would have to deal with, at least in regard to having liability for them contracting certainly the virus. But that is an opportunity for you to look at, depending on your state law and situation, as to whether or not you have work comp coverage or whether or not you're required to have work comp coverage in your state based on the number of employees that you have, because sometimes certain states include owners as employees for work comp count purposes. So, talk to your insurer on that issue and double check. This is a good time to do that. But generally speaking, if you send somebody out to photograph a wedding and they get the seasonal flu, that's not the sort of thing that you're going to be liable for typically.
Okay, our next question is, what do you do if their client is canceling it in May because they can't afford the wedding anymore? Not necessarily if they can't have it due to health. And I think this gets into the question of certain industries shutting down because of this, and certain industries are being laid off, and that's impacting a client's ability to pay.
Yeah, absolutely, and that becomes and that's something that we see even regularly without an event like this, is where you've got somebody who's committed to a contract, they're committed to certain payments, and they get into the wedding planning process and realize either that they don't have the money to pay you or that they've spent so much money elsewhere that they no longer have the money to pay you. And as difficult as it is for folks, particularly anybody who's put out of work by this, your contract's still binding. And so to the extent that they cancel, not for reasons directly related to closures, as far as events not being able to go forward, if it's strictly a financial issue, even if it flows from the pandemic, then the force majeure clause is not going to impact that, and whatever your standard contract language is on keeping the retainer should be applied in that situation. Of course, the other option, from a business perspective, if they were out of work for a period of time and are currently working, is whether or not you want to extend payments, give them an opportunity for that sort of thing. But again, that's an individual business decision, and as most folks know, because of the ease with which images can be copied, it makes it very difficult to collect after you've delivered product these days. So that's an issue to keep in mind.
Hey, Stephen, we've got a unique question about sports teams. with many sporting events being canceled, do these leagues and tournaments typically carry insurance that would cover the cost of paying contractors? Does such coverage even exist?
So typically, for instance, let's take the NCAA with the March Madness and Final Four, that were canceled. Typically, there's event contracts and things like that where there are provisions that talk about, closures and deposits and things like that. And there may be, insurance out there for that, for, the event as a whole, or, licensing rights, television, that sort of thing. I have not heard or seen of that being available or applied for, something, at the level of a photography contract. So, that's outside of what's called, business loss insurance or something along those lines, which, at this point would probably be, if you don't have the coverage already, it'd be impossible to get. That's probably something that's outside the scope of what you'll run into as a photographer.
And the next question is, does the contract have to specify retainer for it to be valid and not deposit?
So depending on your state and depending on how things are done, the broad definition of a retainer is money paid to retain someone's services to do something. A deposit is something that is paid basically as a down payment. So if you're using the term deposit, we recommend adding the word non-refundable to the front end of that, because in some states that makes a big difference. A deposit without anything else is typically going to be refundable because it's just a deposit, it's a down payment. A non-refundable deposit is one that's paid to hold the date, just like a retainer would be. So to the extent you can use deposit, but again, our suggestion is that you add the word non-refundable in front of it as a safeguard.
I think we're approaching sort of the tail end, but one of the last questions we're receiving is there a relief package put out by the federal government to help small businesses, and will PPA have information about that to help guide us through what we will be able to apply for this? And the answer is yes. We're right now working with our other visual artists organizations to communicate to the federal government, legislators, Congress, the executive branch, that there are industries across the nation that are being affected by cancellations, by travel being inhibited, just by movement of resources, and we will be putting out that information very, very shortly about what we're doing to represent professional photographers in front of the federal government as well as state government. And I mean, this is speaking about small business loans or other financial aid related to that. So please, I hate to say be patient, but the situation is ongoing, and we're keeping in touch with officials from the federal side, from the state side, and also the key is to be in touch with your local officials as well, because there are a lot of decisions that are ultimately aren't being made by federal and state actors, but it's also by your local jurisdictions as well.
Luke, if it's okay, I'll just jump in real quick, and because I see a lot of very kind messages thanking us for the webinar, and thank you, Luke, for fighting through all of this. The other voice you heard was Kristen Hartman, our Director of Member Value and Experience, and she's been monitoring all of this, making sure we do the right thing. And Stephen, as always, I can't think of a more difficult task than to be asked questions from all over the country. to answer these things. But I do want everyone to know that there will be others like this. This is not the only opportunity. We're going to be doing a lot more to try to help our members stay engaged and be prepared, so that when we come out of this, and we will be coming out of this, hopefully sooner than later, but when we come out of all of this, that professional photographers, PPA members, will be able to hit the ground running, and that you'll be prepared. So it is a difficult time, and we feel that in the questions that you asked, but we just want you to know that we're going to continue putting out all the information that we possibly can. If you have any suggestions, please feel free to call us or email us. If you have suggestions on the kind of things you would like to hear in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Luke. I just wanted to add that in while there was a pause.
Thank you, David. And we are approaching the tail end of our webinar and presentation. I would just like to thank everyone for tuning in, and for all of your questions and joining us today. Please stay safe in the coming weeks, and we wish you all the best here at PPA. Thank you so much.